Um, okay, so we're about to start with the next presentation of today. And the next presentation that we have is by Fabiano. Fabiano is a democracy visiting fellow at Harvard University Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and a postdoc fellow at the University of Sao Paulo. His research is on virtue theory, moral psychology, moral status, cooperation, and their implication for the ethics of new technologies. At the Ash Center, he focuses on democratic erosion, new technologies, and the COVID-19 pandemic. If you want to read more about Fabiano, you can see it on the workshop webpage. Now, I'm gonna try to. I looked at your website. You actually give how to say your name properly, so I'm gonna try that. Pei-hua. Hopefully that was properly. Yeah, she nods that I'm doing quite well. He's a postdoc research fellow at the Erasmus Medical Center at the Netherlands. Her research is where bioethics and political philosophy intersect. She's especially interested in ethical and philosophical issues raised by human enhancement technology and digital health technology. So she's the perfect respondent to Fabiano's presentation on should weaponized moral enhancement replace lethal aggression in war. So Fabiano, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. And also apologies that I think this time of the day is the time that my dog takes to bark at passerbys. So if it gets too bad, let me know and I will try to do something about it. I also wanted to say that I drafted most of this presentation when I was a visiting fellow of the Sanford Center for Ethics at Harvard, and I got some valuable feedback from them too. So I wanted to acknowledge that. So the title of my presentation is Should Weaponized Enhancement Replace Lethal Aggression in War? And I found that there's not that much research about this. So those are very tentative, sort of exploratory remarks. I will base my arguments and my considerations starting from two sort of hypothetical scenarios. So imagine a future scenario where in a war, villagers are being coerced and tortured by enemy extremists imposing a radical ideology. So any conventional weapons attempts to intervene would result in most villagers being killed. And I guess we've seen recently that the results of humanitarian or preventive wars are not as one might expect, at least as the US would expect. And these extremists are willing to sacrifice everything to enforce their social norms. So if another country invades and tries to prevent, say, violations of human rights, they are willing to just kill everyone. So what if we could radically reduce those extremists' willingness to harm others to enforce norms without any bloodshed? So there's been already research that found that increasing serotonin levels can lead to increased harm avoidance when enforcing social norms. So people are less likely to use harmful methods that harm other people to enforce norms, what they perceive are the social norms. And neuroscientific advancements might eventually lead to powerful interventions that will be effective in real world situations. And in this scenario, they could be used as weapons. Those extremists could be targeted with technological interventions to dissuade them from risking severe harms in order to impose their radical ideology. So taking control of this village would no longer result in the killing of most of its innocent civilians. Another second sort of maybe scientific sci-fi scenario motivating my considerations. In a war zone, minorities are protesting for human rights and they are about to be violently attacked by anti-protesters that support a majoritarian dictatorship. And the stationed NATO military forces are about to intervene. And the NATO soldiers can use 3 types of rounds in their weapons. They can use large caliber bullets that will be almost certainly lethal. They can use tear gas rounds, or they could use immediate release rounds that would temporarily increase empathy for outgroups. And in addition, the NATO soldiers themselves have taken this empathy enhancer in an effort to reduce unnecessary killings. So all of those 3 rounds can be objected. But I believe, at least I'm not an expert in the area, that it seems that only the first 2 would clearly violate international war law, even though the manipulating their empathy would be considered maybe outrageous to many people. It doesn't seem it would clearly violate international war law. And I will argue for that in more detail. And attacks on an enemy-controlled village that is expected to cause the killing of most of its innocent villagers would be perhaps considered a war crime. But using a physically harmless intervention to dissuade the enemy from fighting would not. These unconventional weapons would leave the international community with serious questions, but they seem to evade current weapon bans. And several people who could be targeted by this kind of weapon would perhaps rather be targeted by lethal weapons and die than let their moral beliefs and dispositions be determined by their enemy, and with good reason. So imagine if somehow Nazis had developed a psychochemical weapons that would vastly increase the ethnocentric prejudices that make Nazi ideology appealing. Many Allied soldiers would rather be lethally shot than to let their morality be significantly shaped by Nazi ideology. And as I said, future advances in moral psychology and neuroscience will likely enable the development of more sophisticated psychochemical weapons. And unlike past attempts at it, they could be efficacious, they physically harmless, and would evade current international war law. They would not be considered chemical toxins or biological agents, like past attempts of psychochemical warfare. And moreover, intervening in the village example would have looser requirements if done without physical harm. And my main argument is that despite evading international war laws and resulting in lax normative just war requirements, the intuition that many would rather die than be targeted by those weapons can be defended considering the harms to personal identity, which could motivate future regulations against it. So first, short intro to moral enhancement, which is primarily done in the civic debate, and it's, as far as I know, it's not being seriously considered militarily. So the main argument for moral enhancement is that, as a general fact, it seems that we often don't behave as we think we should. If there could be a technological intervention that would substantially bridge this gap, it seems hard to oppose. And there are studies, again, that show that many moral dispositions and behaviors, such as cooperation, empathy, aggression, punishment, and parochialism, can be manipulated. Even though we currently don't have any clear example of a definite moral enhancement, we can manipulate those dispositions, and perhaps one day we can sort of set them to better levels than they are right now. And we already use therapeutical drugs that have effects on our moral behavior, such as antidepressants and ADHD medication. And we often fail to use several past technological advances ethically, such as nuclear and chemical weapons. Many of those mistakes seem to have arisen due to flaws in the moral character, and hence that has motivated several authors to examine the possibility of improving our moral dispositions to prevent this kind of problem in the future. And this has been met with a lot of critiques. It's a very polemic subject. I think the first paper about it was maybe 11 years ago, and there's a lot of stuff writing about it. And there are many concerns, feasibility, technical and social implementation, and so on. And I myself elsewhere argued that moral enhancement could be prone to unexpected risks, such as self-reinforcement, undermining personal identity, and group-level paradoxical effects. But so far, moral enhancement, to my knowledge, has been advocated for and criticized on the assumption of civilian use. But many, if not most, recent new technologies was first developed for military use. For example, nuclear power, the internet, space rockets, and satellites were developed for military use before they found widespread application in society. And improving moral dispositions can be used as a powerful war weapon, which I will call weaponized moral enhancement. And moreover, new technologies have had a great impact in the nature of war, from black powder to nuclear weapons to precise drone strikes. For example, extremely precise non-explosive missiles dramatically reduce the cost of foreign interventions by allowing the remote killing of key targets without additional foreseeable deaths. So that having that technology available increases the chance that a country will want to intervene in another country. And even could give better grounds for that intervenence, because if it can find better justification for it, since it will lead to less additional foreseeable deaths. But conventional weapons are inefficacious in deterring enemy attacks in a lot of contemporary warfare. The US very large nuclear arsenal and vastly advanced military couldn't stop, didn't have a deterrent effect on terrorist attacks, at least not on its own. Using neuroscience to affect some kind of psychological deterrence it's being considered by the military. There's like brief considerations here and there in some reports, but there is little research about the ethics of it and the regulations. Moral enhancements for civilian use, the common list of desired effects that our moral enhancement will have includes reduction of out-group aggression and obedience to unfair norms. Both those effects could use it to hinder an army as a form of weaponized moral enhancement. So a bit of a technical definition, maybe that's more useful for philosophers. My definition of weaponized moral enhancement are technological interventions expected to improve moral dispositions independently of war aims, but targeted at the enemy in order to achieve war aims. So there must be independent peacetime reasons for considering the intervention expected improvement in moral dispositions. So a counterexample would be our technologies targeting moral dispositions to cause the enemy to surrender in a just war. So if a country is fighting a war that it believes it's just against an unjust enemy, psychologically incapacitating the enemy through any means so that he would stop fighting could be maybe argued that it's an improvement to his moral disposition. But according to my definition, you would not necessarily constitute a weaponized moral enhancement because it has to be seen as an improvement independent of the war aims. So all else being equal, except the decision to wage war, weaponized moral enhancement would be expected to lead to morally better dispositions. Parochial aggression, it's already seen as an expected improvement to, reducing parochial aggression, which is aggression towards outsiders. It's already seen as an expected improvement to moral dispositions. So therefore, they're using war could be a likely case of weaponized moral enhancement. I have a little bit more detail about the definition. I think I can skip that, and if you have questions, I can go into more detail. So, international war law dictates that a weapon cannot harm more than what is unavoidable to achieve a military aim. So most of the banned weapons have been banned for violating this principle. That seems to be one of the main motivating reasons behind it. And on top of that, more recent technologies such as biological weapons are also indiscriminate. They would spread among combatants and non-combatants alike. Both chemical and biological weapons are likely to cause disproportional levels of widespread suffering that wouldn't justify its use. So on the Biological Weapons Convention, it explicitly prohibits the use of biological agents and toxins as war weapons. And biological agents are defined as those whose effect rely on the multiplication within a target organism and are intended to use in war to cause disease or death. The Chemical Weapons Convention prohibits the use of toxic chemicals as war weapons. And toxic chemicals are defined as those whose action on life can cause death, temporary incapacitation, or permanent harm to humans. And the Chemical Weapons Convention also has a section on banning riot control agents outside law enforcement. And riot control agents would be those that produce short-term sensory irritation or disabling physical effects. And both conventions, they try to take into account future technological advancements, and they use a general purpose criteria that intends to include all future weapons that would be used with the purpose of biological and chemical weapons. And in fact, because of that, the prohibition against chemical weapons does not include all chemicals with toxic effects. It explicitly excludes those used with a purpose that is not dependent on their toxic properties as a method of warfare. And since by presumption, of course, it might never be feasible, but as a conjecture, weaponized moral enhancement would work by manipulating moral dispositions. And physical harms would be side effects to be minimized and not intended. It would not cause foreseeable suffering or physical harm. It would not rely on the multiplication of biological medium. Those will be excluded from the definition of biological agent. It would be excluded from the definition of toxic chemical as well, as it would not be expected to cause death, temporary incapacitation, or permanent harm. It would also not fall into the specific definition of riot control agent, that it would not cause sensory irritation or disabling physical effects. On top of that, even if it had those harmful side effects, it would not be dependent on these harms to achieve its purpose. So even if it would be considered toxic, its purpose would exclude it from the current prohibitions, at least those ones that I look into. And finally, if someone perhaps argued somehow that the current prohibitions do apply to it, at least in the spirit of them, even if not the text, those prohibitions would not be well established because they are not clearly defined there. And prohibitions that are not clearly established are often selectively ignored by most of the world's major powers. So maybe another way of in which it would end up being banned by current international war law is that it's a form of psychological coercion. But it seems that there is no precedent for banning on these grounds alone. Under the doctrine of deterrence, justifying nuclear weapons and vast standing armies with indiscriminate destructive powers, we already accept coercing enemies into psychological states that dissuade them from attacking. And unlike current weapons of deterrence, weaponized moral enhancement would not threaten the lives of billions of people and cause widespread fear. Now, maybe the current laws itself, as they are, do not offer grounds for clearly prohibiting this, But what about arguments based on normative just war theories, on the morality of war rather than the current laws that could motivate better laws in the future? So I try to maybe didactically, as a simplified form, separate into considerations that come from traditional normative just war theories from revisionists. So in those traditional just war theories that rely a lot on current norms and try to see what are the moral grounds for it, it seems that they could be evaded by weaponized moral enhancement in the same way as international war law is. And a revisionist just war theory could rely on an ethical analysis of killing in war to address weaponized moral enhancement. However, as you will argue, weaponized moral enhancement would loosen just war requirements in both of those theories. So both traditionalists and revisionists justification for why it's morally permissible to kill in war is that what makes a combatant liable to intentional killing by the enemy is the fact that he is responsible for a severe enough threat to the enemy to forfeit his right not to be lethally harmed by the enemy to prevent such threat. There are a lot of conditions. However, whatever threat justifies the intentional killing of those responsible for it must also justify lesser harms to those responsible for it if those harms can also prevent the threat. Killing is a greater harm than involuntary improvement of moral dispositions. Therefore, when combatants are liable to lethal aggression to achieve an aim of war, they are also liable to weaponize moral enhancement if it can achieve that same aim. So, in other terms, liability to weaponize moral enhancement is included in liability to lethal aggression, but they do not coincide. So, for example, in civic life, we consider some liable to forced, although ineffective, rehabilitation, but not to lethal aggression. In simpler terms, when killing is permissible, so is forced moral enhancement, but the reverse is false. Now, in traditional war theories, certain unintentional foreseeable harms, such as the emergence of radical factions, could be more easily mitigated. So that it would decrease the expected harms of going to war, and it would increase the compliancy with the proportionality of ends ad bellum requirements. So it would actually make it so that a country could more likely find just cause for war because it has methods to mitigate the damage of it. It could also factor in the peace aim ad bellum requirement, in that its availability would be more likely to lead to a peaceful resolution. In revisionist theories, some preventive, currently unjust cause for wars could become just. So one of the main disagreements between traditionalists and revisionists is that revisionists say that preventive wars can be just, but they mostly think it's rarely the case, although it's possible. And weaponized moral enhancement could offer a safe and efficient way to hinder a conspiracy to commit an attack and heavily factor in antebellum considerations of hope for success and proportionality of ends in preventive wars. So the main justification that revisionists give, at least the ones I look more into, Jeff McMahon and Alan Buchanan, for preventive wars, is that it's in the same way that perhaps, I mean, one of their arguments in simplified forms, in the same way we can stop a conspiracy to commit a murder in civic life, we could also stop a conspiracy to commit severe harms against one's nation. But it turns out that, as we've seen recently, that's not very effective. So they argue that it's in principle possible. There are perhaps cases where this was used properly, but it's rarely the case that it's going to be a just war because the hope for success is terribly low. But if such technology would be available, that would make the chances of success a lot higher. But my main argument here is that despite the fact that international war law and normative war theory would be not very restrictive of the use of moral enhancement, it would actually have severe risks that are not being accounted for. And I'm sort of trying to justify the intuition that at least I have and most people that I have talked to have, that there is something really wrong about enemy manipulating the enemy's moral dispositions. So I would argue that actually weaponized moral enhancement could harm to a magnitude comparable to killing in war, even if it's physically harmless. So elsewhere, I have argued that our moral psychology is likely central to our personal identity, and that this moral enhancement of the civilian kind could damage personal identity. So radical changes to someone's moral dispositions can harm to a magnitude comparable to killing. In fact, given that this philosophical conception of personal identity that I'm using call it the psychological account of personal identity, aims to capture what matters in survival. Others have argued that because current empirical evidence suggests that our moral psychology is the central core of our identity, radical moral enhancement can kill. So it's not just that it's a comparable close enough harm, but it would be the same as killing someone. I don't completely buy that conclusion. Nevertheless, even if we buy that, weaponized moral enhancement, it's unlikely to be a radical moral enhancement. Only certain moral dispositions would be targeted and to a limited extent to prevent a threat or an attack. But it turns out that preventing moral enhancements from undermining personal identity is hard. I have argued that involves careful attention to the preservation of core values and a very gradual implementation. Overt weaponized moral enhancement will have to be quickly implemented to be strategically valuable, so it wouldn't be gradual. And gradual weaponized moral enhancement would be harder to implement and would be likely have to be done covertly, which would raise additional questions. And unlike civilian moral enhancement, or at least the ideal case for it, sharp moral disagreements would almost certainly exist between those employing and those targeted by weaponized moral enhancement. Those weaponized moral enhancement will be more likely to undermine personal identity and more similar to killing than its civilian counterpart, even if it's less radical and more targeted at specific traits. And a second risk that I don't believe it would create harms that are comparable to killing in war, but there are important considerations, are paradoxical social effects. So in my arguments about the case of civilian moral enhancement, I've argued that moral dispositions are intrinsically social and they produce group-level social effects. In complex systems, altering individual-level properties can produce paradoxical effects in the group level. So for instance, if you increase human cooperation, and there's a lot of research that including manipulating those factors artificially, if you increase human cooperation between individuals, it has the effect of decreasing cooperation between groups. So if you make an individual more likely to cooperate with another individual, that will actually make the group that he belongs to less likely cooperating with another group. And this complex social effects would be harder to predict in a sharply different society. Accountability for long-term destabilizing social effects will also be hard to enforce. In preventive and humanitarian wars, there are already similar risks, and it's unclear if weaponized moral enhancement will be comparatively worse. But in the case of in-bello use in defensive wars that are already going on, you would create new risks. So in conclusion, moral enhancement could be first developed for war instead for its proposed civilian use. Weaponized moral enhancement could be used in war by improving the enemy's moral dispositions to dissuade or incapacitate them from attacking without apparent physical harm. It would likely evade many current weapon restrictions and loosen just war requirements. Like other technological advancements, it can change the nature of war. It will likely impact preventive and humanitarian wars the most, which have become very popular recently. However, certain risks from moral enhancement would be worsened in weaponized moral enhancement. It could severely harm in ways comparable to killing a person, but that evade current international war laws and just war theories. It could also face implementation risks due to paradoxical social effects. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Sorry if I spoke too fast.
That was perfect. Thank you very much, Fabiano. And now we move to the response. Please.
Thank you, Ido. I don't know how to pronounce your name.
You can just say Fabiano.
I hope I get lucky this time. For inviting me to comment on Dr. Fabiano's paper. I find this paper extremely interesting and thought-provoking. As many participants of this workshop might have known, involuntary moral enhancement is highly controversial, especially if the moral enhancement under consideration is conducted in a way that does not really directly engage with people's cognitive faculty. And for example, John Harris famously argues that such a moral enhancement would deprive people of their freedom to fail, which is like freedom to make mistakes, so that you are no longer a moral agent by his definition. And in a paper of mine, I also argue that conducting moral enhancement in this way might actually damage our capacity of scrutinizing and revising our existing moral beliefs, because we are morally imperfect. So it's natural that we might need to revise our existing moral beliefs. But conducting moral enhancement in this way could be counterproductive for this kind of purpose. And recently, Tom Douglas also asked that perhaps there's such a thing called mental integrity, which is a bit like bodily integrity, but about our mind. And these arguments, however, focus most on applying moral enhancement to healthy people in ordinary circumstances, or people with morally relevant psychiatric conditions in forensic psychiatry. So as far as I'm aware, none has really explored the ethicality of applying moral enhancement technology in the context of war. This is why I think Fabiano's paper is really making a great contribution to the field. It's because war is a unique scenario where many rights are forfeited. For example, by participating in a war as a soldier, as a being posing a significant enough threat to enemies, one forfeits their right not to be harmed. However, this does not mean that everything goes, as Fabiano's analysis show. According to international war law, lethal weapons like exploding bullets, landmines, and biochemical weapons are prohibited. These two very conditions give rise to a very interesting question regarding the use of moral enhancement in a war zone. And one of the examples Fabiano used in the paper is the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI for short. Studies have shown that people on SSRI will be less aggressive and less willing to inflict direct harm to others. And presumably, SSRI can be weaponized in a way that makes enemy less aggressive and less willing to inflict direct harm to others. In clinical scenario, SSRI is a widely used type of antidepressant. They are not toxic agent at all. They are also not likely to cause any significant physical harm. Just dry mouth or dizziness. These are some of the common side effects of SSRIs. It's unlikely for SSRI to meet the criteria of prohibitions as stated in the international war law. However, the fact that SSRI do not meet the criteria does not mean that weaponized this drug is problem-free. It might just mean that the international war law overly focus on physical harm and needs to be revised. Fabiano proposed two arguments against weaponized moral enhancement. The first is focused on the direct harm a weaponized moral enhancement might bring to the targeted person. According to Fabiano, although weaponized moral enhancement is unlikely to inflict severe and indiscriminate physical harm, the abrupt change of moral dispositions caused by moral enhancement can undermine a person's personal identity to the extent that we might consider the target of the moral enhancement dead. And the second argument focuses on the long-term indirect harm to society. Briefly, while in a war against terrorism, it's desirable to see the terrorists to become less aggressive and more agreeable. This change of moral disposition might not benefit society as a whole when the war ends, and because it could lead to increased compliance with injustice, if I understand your argument correctly. As the very first paper exploring these uncharted water, this piece, I think, nicely highlights several important considerations that might be morally relevant in this context. And I really enjoyed reading this piece, but there are a couple of points I would like to push here. The first is more of a structural matter. The paper did include a concise introduction to just war theory and international war law, but I feel there can be more discussion on issues like why international war law prohibits such and such, and then prohibits the use of landmine and other lethal weapons. And then tease this intuition a little bit more to see if we can extend the intuition to address weaponized moral enhancement. Indeed, the two arguments against weaponized moral enhancement are worth considering, but they are not really linked to the existing discussion on why certain lethal weapons are prohibited. I think if we can have more discussion on that, that would be very nice. And by definition, lethal weapons are tools that can kill. So even if we accept the argument that weaponized moral enhancement can kill in a non-physical way, it's still not clear why using weaponized moral enhancement might be more morally problematic than using, say, M16 to kill, from my point of view. I think it would be nice if you could spill a bit more ink on issues like perhaps indiscrimination to strengthen the case against weaponized moral enhancement. I'm not particularly familiar with international war law either, but I guess there might be some clauses mentioning long-term consequences so that you can tie your discussion a bit better with the existing discussion. Another relevant point is about the set of rights a combatant holds in the war zone. Indeed, most of the just war theories argue that the set of rights possessed by a combatant are different from those possessed by a civilian. And one of the most notable differences is that a combatant forfeits their right not to be harmed. It's not entirely clear for me why, given a combatant can be killed in a morally justified manner, why is it morally unacceptable to kill the very same combatant in a non-physical way? I think things will get trickier if we focus on the war against terrorism. I'm not entirely sure if my hunch is correct or not, but I feel this piece was somewhat inspired by Savlescu's work on moral enhancement, because Originally, he was thinking that moral enhancement could be used as a means to address terrorism. And if we focus on the war against terrorism, then we might need to clarify whether or not a terrorist enjoys the same set of rights as a combatant does. Furthermore, if there are only two options available, one is to kill the terrorist physically, and the other is to use weaponized moral enhancement to kill the terrorist on a non-physical manner and bring in a new and better person into the world. From a consequentialist point of view, it seems to me that using weaponized moral enhancement to fight the war against terrorism is a no-brainer. And indeed, one might rather die, but that doesn't mean that being targeted by weaponized moral enhancement is morally worse than being killed in this context. I also think it's a pity that this paper didn't really address some potential objections like revisability. Although most discussion on moral bioenhancement depicts pharmaceuticals like SSRI as something that will permanently change one's moral disposition, but it's really not the case. So take frozen time, a type of SSRI that is commonly used in treating depression as an example. The half-life of frozen time is relatively longer than other commonly used SSRI, but even if we are talking about these particular drugs, the half-life is only like 2 to 4 days. So they can be washed up from our system pretty fast. And if we focus on the manipulative effects, moral bioenhancement might actually be less concerning than more traditional means like moral education. It's a little bit difficult for one to get rid of the effect of indoctrination, I think, compared to just wash out the chemicals from the system. So if we focus on the case of SSRI, I don't feel using SSRI violates the principle of proportionality as you stated in the paper. Because in a sense, the targeted person is only dead for a couple of days. And once the SSRIs are metabolized, the person is resurrected again. May I say this? I think this also undermines the long-term consequence to society argument. Suppose the war against terrorism was waged justly, and the aim is to restore the order of society. I think presumably the party fighting against terrorism would simply stop administrating SSRI to the terrorists as soon as the war ends. Then the risk of increased compliance to injustice would also not be an issue at all. Finally, I would say the reliance on the premise that moral enhancement can kill is also a little bit concerning. I think as a philosophical exploration, this argument is really interesting, but it also brings in a lot of unwanted moral implication. As a researcher working in a medical center, I feel the argument overlooked the fact that we also use this kind of pharmaceuticals to treat patients like in everyday basis. And in a very nice review paper conducted by Neil Levy and his colleagues, they show that many drugs we use in everyday medical practice can influence people's moral disposition. It's a very good paper for many reasons, but I think the most important contribution of the paper was that it tells us that our moral dispositions are constantly under the influence of different pharmaceuticals. So if moral enhancement can easily kill someone, then a psychiatrist who prescribe things like SSRI to their patients, kind of like killing their patients. I think this kind of moral implication is also worth considering. It's just that find a right balance of the argument, not to push it too hard, so that you also need to accept other things that you don't want to accept. So I think one of the hedge you could make here might be that the case I just mentioned was more of a moral treatment, and moral treatment is different from moral enhancement. So prescribing SSRI in the case of treating depression, it does not constitute a killing. But then one might also argue that administrating SSRI to a terrorist is kind of like treat someone with moral dysfunction, because terrorist. So to wrap it up, I really find this paper insightful, especially although Person and Savlescu have mentioned that moral enhancement could be used as a means to fight against terrorism. They only touch on the lone wolf problem a little bit, and the reason that they use the lone wolf problem in their work was because they want to make a case for compulsory moral bioenhancement. And in other discussion, most only consider issues like moral bioenhancement could be abused by dictators. But this paper really nicely highlights that there's a gap in the existing discussion on moral enhancement, that is the moral permissibility of weaponized moral enhancement. I hope that you will find my comments helpful, and they might sound critical, but I really enjoy your work. Thank you.
Should I reply now? Yeah. Thank you for your comments, and I also found your summary of my paper perhaps even clearer than my own paper. So hopefully I can incorporate some of your explanations there. So it's I agree. I don't go much into it of why international war law prohibits certain weapons. I do a superficial analysis of what are the basic principles that will be evoked, such as proportionality of means or not creating unnecessary harms. But I don't look deeper into it. But my assumption part of it, one is that this is not my area, so it's hard to get too deeper into it, but I do hope to do that eventually. But another reason is that I would think that in the end, all those principles would revert to some kind of normative just war theory. So if in the end, the normative just war theory couldn't handle it, you couldn't really bridge the grounds, the principles you would have motivating are just not there. But perhaps there is something sort of in between philosophy and current law that could be used. I've been meaning to look more into something about human dignity, whether severe violations to it are considered a war crime. And in that case, you could say that involuntarily changing one's moral disposition would severely offend human dignity. So it is, as you said, it is part of, I don't know if there was an objection or a description, but just to make clear, it is part of my argument that moral enhancement would be less harmful than killing. And I only mention a paper that says that radical moral enhancement that would be much more than just antidepressant that would radically change one's moral disposition could be like killing, but I don't myself agree with that. But I do see how it could be creating harms that are perhaps in the same kind of category as killing. There are very severe harms. And I think the fact that it's hard to see them as bad as killing, it's part of my argument, and it makes them stronger. Because it ends up that it's hard to regulate them, and they create more relaxed just war requirements. And I mean, I do agree personally that if there are two options available. One is weaponized moral enhancement, even if it's radical, or to kill weaponized moral enhancement would be better. But there seems to be, my worry is that there is still big issues with it, and they seem to be missed by the current framework. And from the perspective of the enemy, you could see how he might actually rather die than have his moral dispositions radically change. We often think this, I feel like the instinctive sort of way of thinking is like, oh, suppose I'm on the just side of the war and I'm using it against the enemy, would that be so bad? But if we, in my example, for example, if you are an allied soldier fighting against the Nazis, supposedly every side always think that they are on the just side. If the Nazis were to implement something that would make the soldiers much more likely to accept Nazi ideology, it seems to me at least plausible that many people would rather just die. They would rather be shot at than be targeted by this. So as I said, well, the SSRI case, so currently most people don't even see that as even as a mild moral enhancement, at least not what we have. So even a mild moral enhancement would have to be more powerful than current SSRIs. And in the case of using war, it seems like you would have to have even if it was short term, you wouldn't have to have a very powerful effect, because if you just give SSRIs to terrorists who are holding a village hostage, they are not, from what we've seen in empirical studies, the effect is not huge. So they're not just gonna go home and say, oh, we're peaceful now. It would have to be something extremely potent. So even if, let's say chemically, that will go away from their systems in a few days, I think there will be long-lasting changes, because morality has to do with sort of higher order motivational systems. That's one of my arguments in another paper. And if you change that, it doesn't tend to be reversible. So if you start valuing something else, it cannot just go back to the place it was just because you're not taking the drug anymore. But I mean, that's kind of its own argument. Maybe I have to detail it more on the paper. And that, again, I agree that proportionality of means would greatly count in favor of weaponized moral enhancement. And that's sort of maybe what I'm concerned with, that you actually, current principles would be true in favor of weaponized moral enhancement. That actually surprises me, because I would expect that there would be something there that would say, no, we can't do that. My initial motivation is like, I'm gonna write a paper how maybe we can use this in war and it's not as bad as people think. And then I went to looking for like other arguments that people would have against it, and I couldn't find anything. And I was like, well, maybe the problem is actually that it would be too permissible under the current framework. Then yeah, the SSRIs, I agree, won't be like killing at all, but a more powerful and potent moral enhancement could be closer to it. And thank you again for your comments and for your summary of my paper that I thought was very clear.
Thank you, Fabiano. Now we move to questions. Agatha, please.
Thank you. It was a very interesting topic, and certainly not very legal. That's why it made me so interesting, because it was so much different. So I have a different, maybe a little bit of science fiction question, but you mentioned that perhaps in the future this neurochemical, psychological kind of weapons will be developed and for the military purposes. So are you aware that any states are currently working upon developing such weapon, or are they testing maybe already such weapon? Do you know that whether it is in plans of any states to create such weapon, on what level it could be in the states? Do you have any information on that? I would appreciate any information on that. Thank you.
So there was a lot of, maybe not a lot, but surprising amount of research in psychochemical warfare by several intelligence agencies, including maybe most famously the CIA, but that was 50 years ago. And in the end, it was extremely harmful, the things that they were considering, so they'd probably be banned under current law. But the main reason they didn't pursue it was because it wasn't effective. But there's been a lot of advances in neuroscience since then, and we understand a lot better how to manipulate moral dispositions. So I would think that if there were a program now, they would get something a lot better and more refined than what they had then, that would then evade current regulations. I think on my paper, there are like 2 citations of papers who briefly talked about it. They say, oh, one other way we could use neuroscience or enhancement in war would be to change enemies' social or moral dispositions, but it's very brief. But if I remember correctly, both of those papers are, one is from the US military university, and I think the other is from a NATO institution. So one would think that somebody there is at least considering it, then it might be a matter of time until they realize, oh, look, we have this new technology we could be using. And I mean, I don't think there is intense research, and I haven't seen any evidence. Of course, it would be secret, but given that the state of the science right now, it doesn't seem like we would be able to do it. But it seems we are getting closer, and that's sort of my motivation for worrying about it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Agata. And now, Kaya?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your refreshing article. I have to make a disclaimer. I'm a total ignorant when it comes to philosophy. So every time I read about revisionist and the other theory, I have to check it. I understand it, and then I forget it. So I'm not a specialist in your field of expertise. But it happens that for this workshop, I prepared my paper on human enhancement, on cognitive enhancement, which could be probably something like weaponized moral enhancement. I'm not sure, we have different definitions. But I did my PhD on weapons law, on case of lethal autonomous weapons. So I went through all the regulations, and I have some remarks that may be helpful for you. At least they can be treated as directions and some clues where to look for a relevant law. And my first remark is that probably something that is being taught to all lawyers to differentiate between jus ad bellum and jus in bello can be helpful, because in both fields of law, we have proportionality principle, which means totally different things. And in my opinion, and I will be here like very bold and direct, just to make sure that my idea is being transferred clearly. I think that proportionality principle was never the main argument for prohibiting any weapon. Biological, chemical weapons were prohibited because they were not fulfilling the principle of discrimination. And because proportionality is something that is involved in bell law, in law of armed conflicts, which is different from use of force, which is ad bellum. At another level, when we have already a weapon and we want to use it, then the proportionality is the biggest principle that plays role. Before that, and we have several different principles, discrimination. So ability to differentiate between civilians and legal military objectives, targets, is one of the reasons why biological weapons were prohibited. Some argue that nowadays with with nanotechnology, probably wouldn't have that convention, because we could control those chemical biological agents on very nano level, so they could be discriminated. But what I think could be interesting for you is to look for some links between international law and morality and moral considerations, because when we talk about new technologies, we usually go there because we cannot find, as you said, strict norms prohibiting a specific new invention that didn't come to mind of people who were negotiating treaties 20, 40 years ago. And I would start with something called Martin's Clause, which says that weapons that are, because this weaponized moral enhancement, I would classify it as a weapon, means of warfare, of combat. That's something that is against principle of humanity and dictates of public conscience cannot be allowed. It means that this is something reversed from what we know, that when something is not prohibited is allowed. Martin's Clause changes this dynamics and says that there are also moral considerations. And this Martin's Clause is being repeated in several international treaties, in preambles, but also in provisions. And one of the treaties that you could look for is also a treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons that was that entered in force, I think, this January, and which also stresses, because you cited the ICJ opinion on nuclear weapons, and I think that it's also very important to revise it in the light of this new treaty. So Martin's Clause and those moral considerations. The second principle, apart from discrimination, that is taken into account when we do the so-called legal review of a new weapon, is also something called Cyrus, I don't know how to pronounce it in English, prohibition of superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. And you mentioned it somehow in your paper. You used those words, but maybe you didn't frame it as a principle. But this is a very vague principle that is very hard to interpret. ICRC tried to do that and it failed. But there are some voices in doctrine saying that psychological harm, so something that could be provoked by this weaponized moral enhancement, can be a part of unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury. So you could go into that principle to see whether this weaponized moral enhancement can be prohibited under this principle. And actually that brings me to third convention, which is CCW convention with very long name, and probably nobody remembers the full name, but there is one protocol to that convention on blinding lasers, which considers something you mentioned in your paper, so long-term social effects. Why blinding lasers were prohibited? Of course, because they provoke this long-lasting blindness, but also when you go to travaux préparatoires, so those all the documents before the treaty was adopted, you can see that some states, I don't remember now which one, probably US, I would guess, say that we cannot allow those weapons to be developed, and they were never deployed. So this is also the case for all new technologies that we call science fiction. We cannot allow them because the cost of providing some kind of compensation and, you know, how you call it, like social help for veterans of that kind of war who would be blind for life would be too much, too big burden for a state. So really going into reasons why states prohibited ever any weapon, for me, unfortunately, the conclusion was very pessimistic and cynical. States don't prohibit weapons because they kill people. Killing is allowed. States prohibit weapons because they kill in a very bad way. So they add this superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. So I wouldn't say that everything, because if we were to prohibit killing like lethal weapons, we wouldn't use any weapons, yeah, any Kalashnikov or a simple gun. And when you look for arguments how to kill people in war, to be bold, I think you could also go and look for the fear doctrine, and started with and now I forgot the name of the guy, but the other researcher is Gabriela Blum, probably that's the correct pronunciation, from Harvard, who is the proponent of least harmful means doctrine that says that we should include all less lethal weapons and ways of eliminating combatants from the warfare. So that would go along with your argument that this moral enhancement could be something better than just killing. And yes, that's all my comments. I'm so sorry for this long comment, but I'm like really feeling this topic, so I wanted to indicate some thoughts of mine. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was extremely helpful. That's the kind of feedback I was dreaming of, because that's exactly the area I don't know much about it, and I'm constantly thinking of there's probably like some regulation that I don't know about that actually applies here. Yeah, I think I mentioned proportionality both in Bellum and Bellum, but I did mostly rely on proportionality in Bellum. And
yeah, but what I'm saying that this actually doesn't matter for legality of weapon. It means for legality of use of that weapon, but not legality per se, which is just a bit different for lawyers, but maybe it's too much detail.
Okay. Yeah, I would look more into that. And how do you spell this clause? You should ban.
I will write now all the names that I put.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, in the chat. Thank you.
And yeah, with like what weapons that create superfluous harms, or even that, I think maybe blinding lasers. I'm not sure if it's included on that, but I think it's weapons that can. I remember reading about weapons that have projectiles that can hit a bunch of other people and it's not going to kill them. It's just going to probably make them disabled or something. It seems that the reason that it's not proportional because the effect it causes, it doesn't really prevent the enemy from fighting. They can still perhaps keep fighting, and it seems like I think I would be even more cynical of what you were about that people are against it because they kill in a bad way, but it's also because they don't work. So it's almost like, we don't even want to use this.
Well, that's the big discussion, this least harmful means doctrine comes from the interpretation of St. Petersburg declarations, which was originally in French and was relating to that the aim of the war is not to kill, but to eliminate people from the battlefield. I don't do the citation here because I don't remember it from my head. So that was at the end of 19th century. But then the 20th century showed something different. So that's why we have this kind of, I don't know, schizophrenia, that we think that killing is not allowed, but then we allow weapons that are killing people, but we prohibit weapons that can do some more harm, turn people into zombies, like with your SSRI. Really, that's the argument, right? And what are the long-term effects? That's very important. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I probably have more comments, but I would stop. Maybe we mail you afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. Just before we move to Leah, since pronunciation has become an issue here, and will be forever, it's Gabriela Blum. Blum is our last name. Yeah.
Blum. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Leah, we move to you.
Thank you. Again, I found, lawyer, not my area of expertise, but I found the paper fascinating, especially the normative questions under just war theory. In terms of the is it permitted question, I found myself reaching to international humanitarian law, human rights law rather than international humanitarian law. And I say that because while things may be permissible or not permissible under international humanitarian law, human rights law still does apply during a conflict or non-conflict. And it seemed quite clear that so many human rights may be triggered through the use of cognitive enhancement or these moral drugs, freedom of conscience, liberty, association, expression. All of these things would be engaged through the use of this type of weapon, especially in a kind of belligerency or a counterterrorism situation where it's not, green guys on one side, red guys on the other fighting each other out, where it would have implications for the larger civilian population. So, well, I think IHL does have, you have to look to IHL. I think there's also a lot that human rights law could give you here in terms of argumentation against the use of these weapons. Well, I've never seen the human rights argument made around this type of weapon. There is a lot of debate right now about population control through surveillance, for example. So it gets somewhat to the same kind of idea of controlling groups of people, limiting their actions, making them less free through surveillance means, and how that, whether or not that's permissible under human rights law during an armed conflict. And there are those that argue that it's certainly not. So that might be another area to, not necessarily for this paper, but if you wanted to expand your understanding of the law that applies to these types of weapons, that might be something to look for.
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe I should make this point more explicitly, and I agree, I didn't look into humanitarian law at all, is that my concern is that I try to avoid making the mistake of, well, we have this really good law of war, humanitarian law, and that would actually apply here, and you would ban it, so problem solved, next page. But even the treaties that most of Europe's it's a signatory to, the US explicitly doesn't follow. So I guess they say that they will follow on the German basis, but the US official position about international war law is that it doesn't apply to us. We didn't sign it. We will do whatever, it's in our best interest. And there's even I read the statistical research that look into, I think, over 200 instances of the US use of force, and more than half of them were unilateral. It took those actions without consultation with other countries. And I mean, the US, even from the long list of other countries that violated, the US is not even the worst case. It's just the one that sort of dominates the military right now. But so perhaps that could be an argument for, maybe those kinds of laws were actually better than sort of what we have. And there's even more reason to advocate for it. But on the other hand, I also worry that from the risk assessment perspective, if I just say, there is this humanitarian law that would ban it, I can't really say, there is no risk. So yeah, maybe I should make more clear the goals of my paper, and maybe have separate sections with sort of what would likely happen and what are the risks and what is sort of the ideal framework or better framework that we could apply here. Perhaps that's not very clear, but I will definitely look more into the humanitarian law application here. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's my turn now. I think I'm going to start with a kind of a simple comment, and then I will try to do something brave and talk about actually just war theory. Even though, again, I've done some research on just war theory, but much like previous respondents, I'm more of a lawyer than a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher, to be more exact. I think the initial comment is that you have to be clear who is your target audience with this article. Because you can see that lawyers get, and lawyers and moral philosophers speak different languages completely. Some try to communicate in between, especially in our world. Just war theories like Adil Haq and Liav Liblich and Yanin Adil, Ellen Four and Seth Lazar. They're all trying to do that, to bridge the gap between moral philosophy, just war philosophy, and international laws of non-conflict, IHL. Even terminology, you use international war law, and we use laws of non-conflict or international humanitarian law. And these are not important things. I'm just saying, make sure that you know who's the target audience of the paper, and make sure to focus that paper for that audience, because as you got amazing feedback here, but you got a lawyer's feedback, and lawyer's feedback not necessarily be relevant to a moral philosophy, just war article and the audience. And you can see that the type of feedback that you receive from a philosopher than to the lawyer, the feedback you received from the lawyers is very different. We're much more detailed on you should look at this convention or the other convention rather than the big concepts which more philosophers usually tend to look at. That's my 2 cents on that difference on before I get to the comments. Now, when I look at just war theory and generally about the moral questions here, one of the main questions, the differences between the traditional approach and the revisionist approach is about the dependency between ad bellum and in bello, which means what about just combatants and unjust combatants and their status in the battlefield, and the equality, which is the outcome of that. Now, what happens within that framework if I add the moral enhancement to either the just or the unjust side of the conflict? If the unjust side knows or received the moral enhancement drug or treatment or whatever we call it, what is their status from now on? I mean, you gave the example of they might still think that they are just, and then that wouldn't change anything. And then you have the worst example that the just combatants might think that they are unjust and switch to the other side, switch from the Allies to the Nazis, which is the worst case example that we can think of. But what is the status of an unjust combatant, like the protesters, which are not necessarily combatants, but that's, again, a lawyer's perspective on the issue. But the unjust protesters who receive the moral enhancement and now are no longer a threat. Are they a legitimate target or are they innocent from that point on? Am I allowed to target them? Am I allowed to stop them? At the moment, there are no, if I understand you correctly, they are not posing a threat once they receive the moral enhancement drug. So if they are not right now, but they will be later on when the drugs runs off, can I target them while they are not posing any threat? Now, within international humanitarian law, I would say status is status. They are combatants, they are a legitimate target, therefore, unless they are hors de combat, they are placing outside of the cycle of warfare. Which, again, brings a question. Are they outside of the cycle of warfare while they are subjected to that drug? So that there's a lot of kind of spiraling on that situation, which I would go to a moral philosopher on that question specifically. So this is why I'm asking you that. Hopefully I'm trying making the point clear enough. But and on the other side, I think Leah referred to that a little bit about the fact that human rights is also an issue here. Could we, and I think I would direct that question also to you, Pei, can we compare using that drug to force feeding or force treatment of a prisoner or a patient? A patient, because we are forcing a drug on them eventually. So can we make that comparison between putting that drug against the enemy and putting that drug against a prisoner who is on a hunger strike, and we want to make sure that they actually survive? The outcome is a bit different maybe, but the question is, are there similarities from moral perspective on that? And yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here.
Thinking that the status of combatants, it seems like a very interesting case. I could even, I don't know if I'll write a second paper just about it, or even maybe make this paper more about it. And I would like to say there was a disclaimer that even though I am from philosophy, I am not an expert in just war theory. It's not my area, but I tried to read some of it. I read a book and a few papers while writing this paper, and maybe I have a higher tolerance to sort of convoluted arguments, but it's not my area, so it's very possible that you all know more about it than me. And the target audience, I think it's really good advice. The problem is that I guess that I would better focus more on the philosophical audience because it's my area. But in terms of risk assessment, I would still like to say, look, the current laws that we have are not sufficient or something of that sort. But I don't know, maybe that shouldn't be such an important part of the paper, since it would be much harder for me to go into that. One thing that happens a lot with my papers, I end up splitting them on 2 and 3 papers. So that might be something that I have to do if I want to keep going with this research. And so in the case, it seems like at least like a philosophical analysis, like of the ethics of killing, or like an individual killing another. And it seems like that would apply also in war law. So, for example, if using conventional weapons, soldier attacks the enemy and it disarms them, can they shoot them? Can they attack them? It seems that they can't, right? Even if they would have a status as a combatant, can you shoot down a combatant that you know is unarmed and is not a threat to you?
Well, so it really depends. If that combatant is either injured or captured or surrendered, you can't. Otherwise, you actually can. Even if they are sleeping, you can. Kaya is making a kind of phrase. I'm writing a PhD on that. I can argue the other way around completely. But generally, IHL, the mainstream of IHL would say, unless a person is either injured, captured, surrendered, or dead, you can attack them.
That's true. I'm just waving because this is exactly the least harmful means doctrine saying. And if I am already talking, I'm so sorry. I want to say that, of course, Ido's remark on interdisciplinary research is so to the point, because it's always hard. Just imagine I was writing an article, and in one phrase I would just write that there is no philosophical doctrine on that. But I didn't research that. So, it's the opposite when you write that there is no law, but you didn't research that. And of course, wording is so hard, especially also in new technologies. Understanding all those technical words and biological, medical, etc. is such a challenge. So don't be, I don't know, depressed, or don't get any negative thoughts out of this feedback. But this is just so hard. That's why it's so inspiring at the same time. Sorry, that's coming back to combatants.
Yeah, but I mean, if you would say that that combatant is simply invalid, he can't attack you, but just because he's, I don't know, not captured or injured, like you can still attack it, then I mean, that's clearly wrong.
Actually, this is traditional just war theory. Michael Walzer, he's made the case that has led a lot of the discussion that a combatant is targetable. Revisionists would argue otherwise. McMahon argue otherwise, but Michael Walzer, who is the leader of the traditionalist view on just war theory, this is his argument, that you can target a combatant basically at all time unless he is no longer part of the conflict.
Yeah, I think I probably read too much of the revisionists and like end up having sort of their explanation of what the traditionalists are like. And even I never read the Walzer. I mean, I read like quotes part of it. And I read mostly the Seth Lazar.
Just to make the point, on my table right now is Unjust War by Michael Walzer. So I intuit that very much, but yeah, you need to go to the traditionalist before you go to the revisionist, just to know what they are fighting against. Yeah, we have, yeah, please. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so just a follow up on the previous discussion. I guess that is also why I was trying to push you so hard on whether non-physical killing is more morally worse than physical killing, because like Ido and other people say that in war, so long as you are a combatant, then you could be targeted and you could be killed in a just way. So if we accept this framework, then I feel then we need to go further to say something like, yes, you could be targeted, you could be killed, but there are certain ways that's prohibited. So say now we can't really use their mind. And I feel that if you could push your argument into that direction, then that will really, really make your case even clearer. Because currently in your paper, you were mentioning things like moral enhancement can kill. So even if we accept that premises, okay, we still don't really see why then in a just war context, we can't use moral enhancement to kill. So that's just a follow-up on my comment. I hope that I can make my case more clear.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's some clarity issue that I have to improve in the paper.
And that's the purpose, basically, of the workshop, right? We're taking early career researchers and provide them feedback and guidance in order to make the paper better, in order for it for later on get published in the best way that we can. So I think, unless there are any more comments, I think that we can conclude that session as well. And I want to thank Fabiano. I want to thank Pei-hua for their participation and in this very, very interesting presentation and discussion. And not tomorrow. I'm used to a physical version, which is day by day. But our next session is going to be actually on Sunday. It's going to be just as interesting and just as thought-provoking. We're going to have presentation by Kaya and by Ivan, and it's going to be great, interesting. So please join us. And once again, thank you all for participating in this great discussion. I want to thank Pei and Manu for being the respondents. And have a nice day, evening. I think Lea left already, so we can't have lunch anymore. All right, so have a nice evening, all of you.
See you on Sunday. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.